You are a novice monster hunter wandering fields of lost lives, surrounded by the shrieks of metal swords and the smell of gunpowder. What will your legacy be? That of a warrior, wielder of giant weapons? Or that of a comrade, a reliable partner to those who also walk the path? Everything depends on your will. May your time in this world etch itself into your memory as an experience you will never forget. These are the words written in the Japanese game manual for Monster Hunter, a 2004 hunting action game developed and published by Capcom. Ever since its humble beginnings on the PlayStation 2, the series spawned from this game has grown into a true juggernaut, with one of its sequels, Monster Hunter World, becoming Capcom's best-selling game ever. But between the accolades, the innovations, and the railgun wyverns, it's easy to lose sight of where it all began. How did that original game come to be? Who worked on it? And what were their thoughts and feelings as they did? In short, how was Monster Hunter created? The turn of the millennium. As the big year 2000 looms, gaming is about to enter an entirely new era. The PlayStation 2, which is due to release in the first March of the 21st century, presented a new frontier for video game technology, boasting improved specifications and functionalities compared to the current market consoles. One of these exciting new features was online play. Through the use of a network adapter plugged into the console's expansion bay, the PlayStation 2 promised the ability to have players connect and game together. At that time, online gaming had been mostly exclusive to desktop computers, and the concept of combining the specialized gaming tech of a home console with online multiplayer was extremely tantalizing. One company that was closely observing these new developments was Capcom. The Japanese video game giant had enjoyed a successful run in the games industry of the 20th century, and was looking for new innovations to invest in for the new millennium. And so, Capcom Production Studio 1 suggested an initiative. The division was to create 3 games for the PS2 that would make heavy use of the console's online features, with the ultimate goal being that at least one of these games would spawn a franchise capable of selling 1 million units. The 3 game projects were Automodelista, a technical racing game rendered in a cel-shaded graphical style. The game was to be directed by Hideaki Itsuno and would use PS2 Online to allow for 8-player races. Resident Evil Outbreak, an entry in the popular Resident Evil series directed by Eiichiro Sasaki. The game would use PS2 Online to group players into squads that would have to work together to survive various zombie-related scenarios. And the third game, which was not as clearly defined as the other 2. From the very beginning, Production Studio 1 imagined this as a real-time action game that would allow players to cooperate using online play. There was also a desire to make it friendly to casual players, as online multiplayer games were at the time seen as fairly hardcore in essence. A core theme to this project was that players would team up to battle big and imposing bosses. And so, in 2000, Production Studio One assembled a small team that would create this third game, starting from the vague notion of an online action game that everyone could play. This game would, for a long time, only be known by a placeholder name: MH Project. This project would prove to be no easy task. Online action gameplay was a high bar to clear in those days, and the goal of creating a game that could appeal both to people familiar with online play and casuals alike was certainly not any easier to achieve. But nonetheless, the small team pushed onward and landed on some key ideas soon after the project kicked off. With Shintaro Kojima and Katsuhiro Eguchi as leading planners/game designers, and Tsuyoshi Tanaka as producer, the MH Project team began working on a game inspired by the popular Dungeons & Dragons tabletop RPG series. Soon, the team had produced concepts of players clad in medieval armor, banding together to steal riches from under the noses of slumbering dragons. The concept progressed to also include extensive battles against these dragons and creatures, in which players would use saw blade-like attachments on their weapons to literally rip valuable materials off of the creatures' bodies. All of these elements would have to be synchronized across all participating players, which would require a robust online infrastructure. In order to ensure that, the team was soon joined by Ryozo Tsujimoto, son of company founder and CEO Kenzo Tsujimoto. The younger Tsujimoto already had some experience working with online systems, and served as a network technical advisor and software designer for all 3 games of the Studio One initiative. But ideas can only get a project so far, and while the setting and tone of the game were being crafted meticulously across multiple concept illustrations, the actual gameplay of this game was still up in the air. While it was to be an online action game, what did that look like? What were its controls, its graphical styles, its technical specifications? The team struggled to fully commit to an answer to these questions, experimenting with various 3D and even 2D gameplay ideas, including side-scrolling and real-time third-person action. The project ping-ponged between numerous such ideas, and was additionally caught up in some office tension. Some higher-ups within Capcom were quite enthusiastic about MH Project, which led to unusually consistent involvement from them. This added pressure onto the team to produce something specific bosses would like, and resulted in sudden and sometimes odd course corrections. In one representative case, a designer had approached such a higher-up with concept art of various goblin-like creatures that were meant to serve as an enemy type. Said higher-up, however, simply responded with, "I don't like it," leading to panicked redesigns and eventually ending in the whole folder being thrown into the pile of discarded concepts. There was, however, another problem. The MH Project team had no clear hierarchy. As great as this was to ensure that every idea was heard, it also led to constant indecisiveness, as different members of the team could sway the entire project in one direction one day, while the next day, another member would advocate for a different approach. The 2014 developer chronicle Monster Hunter: Principles of Creativity describes this situation bluntly. At that time, the design process was basically led by whoever had the strongest opinion that day. The idea of a formal hierarchy really had not been discussed at all. And so, MH Project struggled for some time. Even the addition of another game designer in Kento Kinoshita, who worked both on MH Project and Automodelista, could not properly alleviate this situation. In 2001, the project would be officially renamed, with MH Project giving way to a new title, Monster Hunter. This title had already been used unofficially by various members of the team, but due to it being a very generic combination of words, they had generally believed that naming the game like that would be impossible due to pre-existing copyrights. After all, surely there was no way that Monster Hunter hadn't been claimed yet, right? Once they realized that no one had actually verified this, the development staff investigated the matter and discovered that the name was in fact not yet trademarked. And so, Tanaka and his team filed for the trademark and claimed Monster Hunter as the official name for their blossoming game project. But even with a new name, the project had a hard time coming together. Then, in 2002, after 2 years of staggered and insecure progress, Capcom Production Studio 1 made 2 declarations that would drastically change the course of the company. 1. The Monster Hunter staff were instructed to get their priorities in order and focus on delivering a proper game within the near future. And 2. They were going to add another team member to the project, a man with seniority and experience in the video game business. That man was Kaname Fujioka. Fujioka had previously worked on numerous arcade titles, such as JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and Darkstalkers 3, as a pixel artist and animator. Experiences that, on paper, would not necessarily be the miracle cure for Monster Hunter. And yet, Production Studio 1 chose him, because besides his specific background, Fujioka had participated in many completed game projects, and thus was considered a senior compared to many of the other members of the Monster Hunter project. The idea was that he would offer guidance to the younger staff members and direct the flow of ideas into a more productive and clear direction. This worked out better than anyone could have foreseen. Almost immediately after being added to the team, Fujioka began poking his head into every concept and design proposal, freely speaking his mind and extensively elaborating on his strong opinions regarding this game project. And before long, something unexpected happened. Both previous and new members of the Monster Hunter team approached Fujioka and asked him point blank if he'd like to lead the project. In a 2009 interview with Satoru Iwata, Fujioka describes this moment as follows. "I was the type to harp on the contents of the game, and they were like, well, if you're going to be such a pain about it, why don't you just be the director?" After some hesitation, Fujioka accepted the newly formed position and, in the process, decided to formalize the roles within the team to divide responsibilities more effectively. And so, the core Monster Hunter team finally formed. At the top level, Kaname Fujioka served as game director, supported by Tsuyoshi Tanaka and Kenji Itsuno as producers. Then, Katsuhiro Eguchi, Kento Kinoshita, Shintaro Kojima, Hoki Fuse, Tomohiro Nakai, and Tsuyoshi Nagayama would serve as the main planners/game designers, forming the nucleus of interdisciplinary design decisions and proposals. This core would be supported by various specialist teams. Ryozo Tsujimoto served as online systems planner, building the network that would support online play. Meanwhile, the art teams under background designer Ryo Uno and CG visual designer Shinya Edaki would be tasked with realizing the look and visual feel of the game. Of course, the game had to be programmed and designed on a software level as well, which is where lead programmer Norio Hirose and his team would come in. And finally, sound design and music would be led by sound director Takeshi Kitamura and his squad of audio wizards. While this established division of labor was intended to give structure and purpose to the newly revitalized Monster Hunter project, Fujioka also insisted on it not being too rigid. While it had contributed to various issues in the project before, the fact that any member of the team could voice their ideas freely and have them make it into the game was something he considered a great strength of the process, if managed with care. And on a more personal level, Fujioka didn't feel comfortable reigning over the development process as a distant leader. He was a designer at heart and wanted to be as hands-on as possible, discussing and testing ideas with his fellow teammates without any barriers of authority or protocol. And so, development on Monster Hunter started in earnest. As the team began to review the concepts and ideas they had created up to this point, Fujioka advised them to ask themselves one question: is this really something only Capcom can make? It was fine and good to create a playable iteration of the famous Dungeons & Dragons universe, but to Fujioka, Monster Hunter represented the opportunity to create a fantasy world entirely unique to the creative minds at Capcom, something that was original and theirs. As part of this push, Fujioka additionally requested that the team discard, redesign, and further avoid any proposals and concepts that included magic, either as a gameplay or world-building element. The idea here was to force the designers into distancing themselves from established fantasy tropes and guide them into a more unique and original line of thinking. Fujioka further emphasized this with another piece of advice: to stop using the word dragon and instead use the word wyvern when discussing the project. Fujioka had noticed that while the game was about hunting monsters, many of the design drafts focused heavily on very traditional fantasy dragons, which he felt held the project back. So by urging the team to think of wyverns rather than dragons, he further hoped to separate their creative process from the pre-established notions of what a fantasy setting had to be like. This approach soon bore fruit. After some discussions with Shintaro Kojima, the team landed on the idea of a fantasy world in which encountering a monster would be like encountering a lion. Terrifying, but not supernatural. Monsters were to be seen as just regular creatures living in this world, with an ecological niche and physical needs that a hunter could learn about and exploit. But what a human within the world would feel at the sight of the monster should also be slightly different from what a player ought to feel at the same moment. Fujioka elaborated on this idea by pointing at the 1993 film Jurassic Park, in which dinosaurs are brought back to life. Fujioka emphasized that when they encounter a monster in Monster Hunter, players should feel like Dr. Grant does when first seeing a revived dinosaur. A mix of awe and disbelief, a creature usually spoken of in the abstract, walking in front of them as a living being of flesh and blood. A feeling of deep connection with something unreal and yet so real. It was a mission statement, a dedication to the imaginative realism that was to underpin all design decisions in the game. With this new approach also came a new consideration for the genre and game objectives. Instead of centering around players stealing loot from catacombs guarded by dragons, what if the core gameplay revolved around specifically fighting these monsters and hunting them down for their materials? This would present a fresh and interesting concept, one that would fit the name better, and one that the team christened with a new genre name: hunting action. And so, invigorated by this distinct and original idea, the Monster Hunter team kicked production into high gear. the first order of business was to finally define the gameplay properly. Inspired by the vision of a realistic, immersive take on a rural fantasy setting, and drawing on his background as an animator, Fujioka suggested creating a combat system that relied on highly committal, expressive animations on both the hunters and the monsters, that players would have to learn and master. The essence of this system would be the timing and weight of each movement, and the subsequent need on the player's side to observe their own bodies and those of the monsters as if they were real, anticipating their momentum and inertia. An immersion-based combat system like this would require a tactile control scheme, which led to the team's decision to have players attack using the right analog stick on the PlayStation 2's DualShock controller. At this time, the exact form of third-person controls had not yet been solidified into any industry standard, but even so, dedicating a thumbstick to combat was seen as an unusual idea within the team for this particular project. Fujioka, however, felt that by having players actually perform an abstracted version of the attack motions of their character, such as swinging the stick to swing a sword, would bridge the gap between the digital and the real. It forced players to contend with actual, real motion rather than just button presses, which could further immerse them into a gameplay style where they have to observe the motions and animations on screen closely. And it just so happened that another piece of this idea already existed within the offices of the Monster Hunter team. A few old sketches from the earlier days of MH Project featured warriors holding gargantuan swords. When reviewing these documents, Fujioka and Kojima realized that huge weapons like these would add a great sense of scale and vastness to their world, as they imagined players traversing large fields to swing large weapons at large monsters. The size would also lend itself well to the deliberate and weighty animations and attacks that Fujioka had envisioned. And thus, the very first weapon type was created: the Greatsword. After some initial testing alongside designer Eguchi, the team realized that they would prefer having multiple weapon classes for variety, so the close-range Greatsword was quickly joined by a kind of mechanized crossbow, the long-range bowgun. A giant warhammer and a lance and shield combo soon followed, but at that point the team noticed an issue. All their weapons were slow and heavy. While that was the ultimate point of the combat system, the current roster would only allow players to choose between heavy hitter options, and featured nothing that would satisfy players that preferred a nimbler approach. Thus, the team quickly created the Sword and Shield, which allowed for faster and weaker attacks. They also split the bowgun into two types. The initial version was turned into the heavy bowgun, while a faster derivative of it was created in the light bowgun. As the micro scale of the gameplay started to come together, the team also pondered how to handle the macro scale. How would progression work? How would gameplay sessions be divided? And how would the game's structure encourage and reward cooperative play? Any answer to these questions would have to conform to the project's mission statement: an online game that anyone can play, a game that could be enjoyed casually if a player preferred that. Fujioka and his team looked to popular MMOs of the time and tried to identify the design decisions that made them hardcore experiences in the minds of casual players. After pondering games such as Final Fantasy XI, Ultima Online, and Phantasy Star Online, the team isolated 3 structural features that, in their opinion, turned off casual players. MMOs demanded extremely long play sessions to clear some of the highest level content. This created a need for players to carve out large chunks of their days for these games, which severely limited the number of people that could responsibly join in on these games. Rewards from MMO events and boss fights were often shared across a party, meaning that players would have to hash out which player gets which item from the reward box. This created adversarial relationships and tension right at the end of an otherwise cooperative experience. Progression systems, such as levels and experience points, trained players in a way that culminated in them identifying the most efficient way to grind XP and just doing that ad nauseum. This led to unfun and unintended gameplay behaviors that often additionally ran precisely counter to immersion, as the game is just boiled down to making just a couple of numbers go up. With these core problems laid out, the Monster Hunter team thus set out to imagine a game structure that specifically avoided these three issues. One idea that had existed since the MH project stage was that gameplay would center around quests, segment of the game in which players would team up to defeat only one or two large monsters over the course of a long and tough battle. A small tweak to this formula immediately solved the first problem. By adding a time limit to quests, the maximum amount of time any one instance of gameplay demanded of the player would be mandated by the developers, who chose 50 minutes as the standard limit. This way, players would never have to commit to any activity that would go on for longer than that, allowing for shorter and more casual play sessions. The second problem also ended up being solved fairly intuitively. If shared loot drops led to adversarial behaviors in players as a response to scarcity, the team decided to simply have every player receive a separate, instanced trove of rewards. This immediately prevented any resentment between players bickering who would be allowed to pick up the rare drop. Either you, as an individual, got it or you didn't. This thinking also influenced the method by which loot is actually acquired. The earlier ideas about ripping monster materials directly off of their bodies were split into two new mechanics. Carving, in which players cut out randomized rewards from the cadaver of a slain monster, and part breaking, wherein the destruction of a certain body part on a monster would limit its attacks and also yield additional rewards for the entire party. This further turned earning loot into a communal activity rather than an adversarial one. The team also briefly considered allowing players to decapitate monsters, but that was ultimately considered as being too brutal and discarded. Curiously, despite the mechanic of using saw blade attachments to rip materials from monsters being scrapped, remnants of the idea would continue to influence weapon designs throughout the development process, such as that of the Agito Greatsword, which retained the saw spikes on its top from this era of production. The third problem was a little more complex to resolve. Levels and XP points were a staple of role-playing games, and reinventing such a foundational design element would inevitably have unforeseen consequences. But after some discussions between Fujioka, Kojima, and Tsujimoto, the team landed on a bold idea. The game had, from the very beginning, included a system in which players would use materials gained from monsters to forge and upgrade equipment such as armor and weapons. What if that system was the only way for players to become more powerful? By removing leveling entirely and making upgrading armor and weapons with monster materials the only way to progress through the game, the nature of the so-called grind changed significantly. Now, players looking to go further beyond in power could not simply find the most mathematically efficient way to monotonously farm XP by doing random activities. Instead, Any increase in power had to be earned through a specific kind of gameplay, by hunting for or gathering the exact material needed for the next upgrade. In other words, if a player wanted to raise their attack stat, they couldn't simply go out and fight 500 low-level grunts. Instead, they would have to target the specific items needed for their next upgrade, which could lead them to a more varied array of activities, from mining to gathering to fighting a handful of different monsters. It lent any grind a greater degree of purpose and created a direct relationship between the gameplay and its rewards. With these 3 questions answered, development moved on smoothly, and many different aspects of the game began being worked on in parallel. However, one more matter regarding the game's structure did come up around this time. The game was originally considered as an online-only product, with no option to play offline. But around this time, the team wondered if it would be possible to add an offline mode to the game that would allow players to continue enjoying it even if all of their friends were away for the holidays or if the servers were shut down. Thus, Monster Hunter was split into 2 modes, conceptualized as different locations. When connecting to the town, players would engage in the intended multiplayer experience, while selecting to go to the village would allow them to play by themselves under different conditions. Kento Kinoshita was put in charge of creating the village mode, with the instructions that it should be a lightweight tutorial portion of the game consisting mostly of reused assets, and that it should serve to teach timid players the ropes within the safety of single player. While everyone was working on their various tasks, Kaname Fujioka began tinkering with his true passion: the setting and world building of Monster Hunter. With imaginative realism at the core, and Jurassic Park as a reference point for the emotional timbre of the monster-human relationship, Fujioka drafted the actual look of the world of Monster Hunter around a certain manga that many members of the team were familiar with: Hajime Ningen Gyatoru's First Human Gyatras by Shunji Sonoyama. This weekly manga Sunday series told the story of a group of cavemen living in the Stone Age and partaking in various relaxed and somewhat humorous shenanigans. Fujioka was struck by how the series merged the brutal reality of the setting with a tone that he described as cozy and almost nostalgic. The world of Gyatras was rough, but it was home, a realm in which hardship and joy coexisted in close proximity to one another. This was the essence that Fujioka wished to emulate within the world of Monster Hunter. And so, he collected the various illustrations the team had created up to that point and iterated on them until he was able to compile and present his vision: a rustic, rural world with elements of both medieval and tribal cultures, inhabited by humans and wyvern people called Wyverians, that came in all shapes, sizes, and dispositions. Monster hunters would then serve as mercenaries, hired by towns and noblemen to slay beasts and use their parts to survive. It was a world in which a character may speak about death by monster one moment, and then present the player with a pet pig in a little outfit the next moment. A harsh nature and a sincere whimsy, living in harmony with each other. In order to realize this setting, Katsuhiro Eguchi took some of the staff along for a research trip, traveling to various places such as South America and Scotland to photograph and take notes on the vast, rural landscapes that the game would try to emulate. As the setting of Monster Hunter began to come together, Fujioka also began discussing the narrative of the game with the team. He and producer Tanaka felt strongly that this game should tell its story purely through environmental clues and incidental NPC dialogue in order to further immerse the player. Moreover, it made the narrative of the game optional. Players that were invested and interested could engage in the story as an active participant and piece together aspects of this world by paying attention, while players that were either less interested or less patient could enjoy the action gameplay without any roadblocks. Tanaka also saw another great benefit in this approach. If the game's communication to the player was vague and cryptic, that would naturally inspire players to ask questions, first to themselves and then to each other. This would, in a best-case scenario, result in networks of players helping each other out not just through cooperative gameplay, but through the exchange of information about all aspects of the game, from understanding the story to unlocking specific weapons and items, and in the process forming deeper bonds and a wider community. In essence, by obscuring direct game information, the team hoped to mechanize players helping each other as an extension of the game's social interactions. As far as the actual plot of the game went, Fujioka initially only defined two key scenarios he wanted to realize: a battle against a giant dragon using defensive encampments like ballistae, and a secret, super difficult boss fight that only the most dedicated players could ever unlock, let alone defeat. But these immersive elements would again demand attention and focus from the player, and had to be balanced against more relaxing and forgiving game systems to achieve the casual online game experience that the team had set out to create. Fujioka suggested creating a variety of mechanics related to simulating the life of a hunter in full. Not merely combat, but gathering, crafting, shopping, fishing, etc. That way, players could choose if they wanted to fight or relax while still progressing the game. One specific example of simulation mechanics like that was the ability to grill meat while out in the field. Here, the team again took inspiration from Gyatros, more or less directly taking the iconic meat on a bone food from the series and including it in their game. This once again injected a degree of whimsy into this harsh world. Sound designer Takeshi Kitamura suggested using a short musical cue as a way to tell the player when to take the meat off the grill, leading to a perfectly cooked steak with the maximum stat benefits. But while the melody itself was created rather quickly, Kitamura struggled with the sound that was set to play upon a successful grilling. As a placeholder, he asked the rest of the staff to record themselves saying "so tasty," with the idea that he'd change it later. The end result was, however, so beloved by the rest of the team that many staff members left Kitamura messages demanding him not to change it under any circumstances, a demand Kitamura eventually agreed to. However, not every part of development was going so smoothly, and the team faced many different challenges. Despite Monster Hunter being conceptualized as a casual action game that would appeal to a wide audience, feedback from Capcom staff in other departments was fairly consistent after playing early builds. The game was too hard, and often felt outright antagonistic towards the player. Nevertheless, Fujioka advised his team to not panic at those comments. Employees from other departments could only ever play single hunts and small fractions of the game, so they would not be able to evaluate all the mechanics that were included to help the player, such as the need to prepare healing items and to use the correct weapon. Fujioka believed that players would ultimately understand that it was their responsibility to modulate the difficulty of their game experience by engaging with non-combat elements of the game to their desired degree. There were also problems within the Monster Hunter team though, specifically between Fujioka and Tsujimoto. Having been promoted to director quite rapidly, Fujioka felt anxious about living up to the task, and thus requested that his team give him brutally honest feedback, even if that meant bending office etiquette. If it would make Monster Hunter a better game in the end, then Fujioka wanted them to speak honestly and bluntly to him. Tsujimoto, however, struggled with this. Not only was he younger than Fujioka, but he was also his junior in terms of experience at Capcom. Thus, Tsujimoto did not feel comfortable speaking to his boss that way, which in turn frustrated Fujioka. The two would clash a few times over their different sensibilities, but ultimately, their time working together on this project would help both of them understand their roles better and, as a bonus, get along. Tsujimoto's troubles during the production of Monster Hunter did not end there. He and Kojima were largely in charge of optimizing online content synchronization and ensuring that when players played together, they would see the same things happening on their screens. For a real-time action game, it was crucial that this system worked seamlessly, and if player A saw a monster walk while player B saw it fly, the illusion would break instantly. Unfortunately, this task clashed with the ambition of the game. Monster Hunter was to include numerous entities in each playable area, including large and small monsters. Synchronizing all of them across players was possible, but it caused significant slowdown and lag. In the end, this was deemed too big of a cost, as it would greatly diminish immersion if the game had to constantly buffer to communicate with other players. Tsujimoto thus landed on a compromise. Large monsters would be synchronized, but small monsters would not. The justification was that players would most likely team up to hunt large monsters, and scenarios in which a team of players would take on small monsters together were expected to be rare. And indeed, this compromise took enough load off of the system that smooth online play became possible. Beyond hurdles like these, there were also features that had to be scrapped fairly deep into development. For example, for a long time the game included a listen command, where players could focus their hunter's hearing to enter a mode of heightened auditory awareness. In this mode, the audio of the game would be altered to allow players to track their targets by sound. It was an ambitious and immersive feature, but the team ultimately decided that it interrupted the flow of gameplay too much and didn't synergize well with other mechanics, leading to its removal. Tanaka also wanted the game to feature a day-night cycle that would allow players to hunt monsters at different times of the day for various advantages and disadvantages. This, however, was never implemented. While all of this was going on, the team was also, of course, busy designing the actual monsters at the center of the game. Creating a monster for Monster Hunter proved notably more challenging than designing video game enemies usually was, due to the game's unique treatment of them. Each monster had to be interesting and engaging enough to still be fun to fight the 5th or 10th time, as players were expected to face them again and again to collect their various material rewards. One problem that quickly arose was that most of the artists in the team were used to creating very detailed illustrations, leading to monster designs that Fujioka later described as gross. They often featured abundant veins, bumps, and other fine textural features that complicated the designs and made them less suitable for the kind of graphical style the game was ultimately settling on. So, the team established what they called the Edayan filter. Any monster design that was greenlit would end up on the desk of CG visual director Shinya Edaki, nicknamed Edayan, who would make the final tweaks and produce a definitive design based on the submission. His process would smooth out unnecessary details and reimagine the designs within a unified art style. Fujioka would later state that the Edayan filter was crucial to not only making the monster designs work well on screen, but to also make them feel like they came from and existed in the same world. The work also did not end after a monster was finalized, as the team would then have to design and test armor and weapons made from that monster's body parts. Lances were especially difficult to create, as the team found it challenging to come up with designs that didn't just look like a long stick with various decorations. Armor designs, meanwhile, suffered from being overly ambitious. Many early documents imagined armors that would give players unique powers they could draw on. For example, the Batman armor would grant the player metal wing membranes they could use to deflect attacks, while the Cocoon Man armor would see the player metamorphose into a powerful butterfly warrior if exposed to enough sunlight during a quest. Implementing such ideas for every armor set was, however, deemed unfeasible, and armors were redesigned to mostly grant increased defenses, with certain armor combinations additionally activating beneficial abilities, such as attack buffs or poison resistance. The very first monster that would make it into the final game had been designed before proper production had even started. When reviewing the old MH project illustrations shortly after joining the team, Fujioka noticed striking drawings depicting a green, spiked dragon. He asked Tanaka about it, and learned that this had been a concept of a poison dragon, which led to Fujioka asking if they could revive this idea. The ensuing design process laid the foundations of how monster designs would be handled overall, and resulted in the first ever Monster Hunter monster, Rathian, a poison wyvern that used backflips to hit players with its poisonous barbs on its tail. Every monster designed after it would be based on it. Fujioka was satisfied with how Rathian had come out, but he also felt that it did not fulfill a specific role that he needed filled. A flagship monster, the creature that would be on the game cover and serve as the mascot for Monster Hunter. Rathian was a very conservative, down-to-earth design as far as dragons go, and Fujioka wanted something a little flashier. However, he also believed that Rathian represented the spirit of Monster Hunter perfectly. In the end, he decided to make a counterpart, a male version of the female Rathian. This male wyvern would be red in color as opposed to green, and was given a fiercer expression and appearance. This creature would be named Rathalos. Fujioka also removed poison from its arsenal, as he felt that it was a tricky, backhanded ability that wouldn't fit the flagship monster. Instead, Rathalos was designed to spew fire from the sky and bombard players with deadly flames. A real powerhouse worthy of mascot status. Once Rathalos had been mostly finalized, the staff team did convince Fujioka to add poison back into the monster's arsenal, as its presence would further link it to Rathian. It was, however, added to the Rathalos' talons rather than its tail, as a flying monster would have better chances poisoning prey with its feet when attacking from above. The influence that Rathalos would have on Monster Hunter as a mascot over the years is obviously quite vast, but its existence also had a pretty profound immediate effect. While drafting out the weapon designs for Rathalos, artist Tomonori Kambe noticed that flavor text in the design document briefly mentioned that Rathalos' bone marrow was highly flammable. Kambe then imagined a sword coated in this marrow that could ignite its blade with powerful flames and burn monsters. After some discussions with Fujioka, this idea was expanded into a system that gave certain weapons elemental damage properties, but only if it was justified through their crafting requirements. For example, if a sword was created using an electric organ, it would only make sense for it to do thunder damage. As Rathian and Rathalos were coming together, Fujioka also requested designs for small monsters. This quickly resulted in the creation of Velociprey, with designers noting that these monsters could be reused across different maps with minor tweaks. Meanwhile, Kinoshita decided to look for inspiration in the discarded ideas pile, and stumbled upon the Goblin design proposal that had been thrown out after a higher-up had disliked it. In that proposal, Kinoshita noticed that the designer had drawn a cat-like goblin variation, which immediately stood out to him as Monster Hunter-like. Kinoshita asked the original designer to iterate on their cat-goblin design, resulting in a new race of beings that could be used as both NPCs and small monsters. Felines, which were friendly, and Mealinxes, which were not. This added another whimsical element to the world and emphasized the tone the team wanted to strike. Mealinxes in particular were conceptualized as devious presences that would steal a hunter's items and force them to find a Mealing stockpile to retrieve their stolen goods. This, however, took some tweaking. Originally, Mealinxes behaved like any other monster, targeting the player continuously. But because every Mealinx attack had a chance of stealing an item from the player, this resulted in a single Mealinx being able to completely empty out a player's inventory in seconds due to their rapid attacks. This was extremely disruptive to the flow of gameplay. During a testing session with the whole team, Tsujimoto suggested a change. Mealinxes should be guaranteed to steal an item on hit, but should also celebrate and then retreat immediately after stealing a single item. This would turn a frustrating mechanic into an opportunity for decision making. Since which item got stolen was random, the player would have to decide if it was worth retrieving or if they could do without and focus on the quest objective instead. The team liked the idea, and so it was implemented. Various other monsters were created in a similar way, reviving old concepts from the MH Project era and making them more appropriate for Monster Hunter. An older design proposal imagined a wyvern that tracked players by sound, in an inversion of the later scrapped listening mechanic that players had access to. This idea then led to the creation of a wyvern with large ears that could be stunned with sonic bombs, a monster named Jan Kutku. Another old draft depicted a giant fortress dragon that could cloak its stony skin in various deadly gases that attacked players by rolling at them, and that players would gradually peel the armor off of until it was thin and pitiful. After some tinkering, it was decided that the rolling attacks didn't fit with the rest of the design, and so the monster was altered to focus more on its bulk, its gases, and a new ability to fire off a destructive heat beam. This monster would later be named Gravios, and a juvenile version of it named Basarios would be created shortly afterwards. One of the most extensive monster proposals created around this time centered around the concept of a creature that weaponized electromagnetism. This document included multiple pages of research on minerals such as tourmaline and quartz, and imagined an intelligent, magpie-like wyvern that collected minerals and shiny objects and arranged them into a nest at the bottom of a valley. During the day, the increased temperature and air pressure would cause the minerals to create an electromagnetic field that would sap the energy of any hunter venturing there. The wyvern itself would have skin similar to rubber and would be completely unaffected, and some sketches even imagined it creating electrical currents by stomping its feet on the floor, and blinding players by creating a flash of light that would bounce around the minerals arranged in its nest. Due to the intricate scripting necessary to make this scenario work, and its reliance on the scrapped day-night cycle, this concept needed to be reworked. The team concluded that the actual appeal of this idea wasn't the specifics of the electromagnetic nest trap, but rather the fact that this monster displayed actual intelligence and forethought. So to retain this appeal, the team reinvented this monster. It could still create a blinding flash by stimulating a mineral crest on its head, but it was also capable of stealing items from players, hitting them from afar with an elastic tail, and playing dead to confuse them. It also received the ability to spew poison as another trick up its sleeve. This monster would be added to the game under the name Gypseros. As the production continued onwards and the game began to take shape, Capcom Production Studio 1 decided that the game would be announced in May of 2003, during that year's E3. This, however, meant that various marketing and branding materials had to be prepared. Fujioka added a silhouette of a Rathian into the game's logo, as a way to honor her role as the first ever monster design. And so, Monster Hunter was officially revealed at the second annual Producers Day within E3 on May 12, 2003. It elicited curious and positive reactions from viewers, with an IGN correspondent describing its setting as part Jurassic Park, part Vietnam. The bulk of the praise was aimed at the game's graphics, with reporters being stunned by how gorgeous and realistic the game looked while running in real time. Overall, Monster Hunter made a strong first impression, even if the reveal trailer included no release date or target console. The trailer did, however, also include something very exciting. At the very end of the clip, hunters are shown facing off against a gargantuan creature. This was one of the big tasks the team had been chipping away at while dealing with everything else, one of the two narrative devices Fujioka had laid out. A giant monster that players fight in a massive, event-like scenario. This was Lao Shan Lung. As this battle was envisioned as a large-scale struggle involving a fortress and artillery equipment, Fujioka and his team spent a long time creating and testing various interactions, such as ballistae, crumbling barricades, and lines of trebuchet. Fujioka was especially concerned about the pace of the battle. Fighting Lao Shan Lung should always be grueling and tense, but there had to be a rhythm to it. He specifically struggled imagining how to inspire players during the final phase, when Lao approaches the fortress gate. The answer to that would come to him from an unexpected place. Masato Koda, one of the composers working under sound director Kitamura, submitted a soundtrack composition called Eiyu no Akashi, or in English, Proof of a Hero. It was a powerful piece, full of hope, determination, camaraderie, yearning. Upon hearing it, Kitamura sought to discuss with Fujioka where and how to use it, as it would certainly be quite a memorable song. Fujioka, in turn, immediately understood that this piece would have to play as the player began their final stand against Lao Shanlong. The resulting combination was so effective that Fujioka asked Koda to think of ways to incorporate the leitmotif of Proof of a Hero into other compositions. For its part, Lao Shanlong came together after some tinkering, with its fight centering around attacking it as it made its approach to a fortress. Fujioka requested that the monster walk underneath a bridge at some point, as he personally really wanted to give players a chance to hop on Lao's back and ride the dragon. Around this time, Fujioka would suggest another unusual monster. This one would be fought rarely and was going to have a body shape unlike any other monster in the game. Instead of a wyvern, this would be a beast, an equine entity resembling an Asian myth, the Kirin. Clad in an eerie light and able to summon lightning from the sky, this phantom beast seemed to break the no magic, no traditional fantasy rules that Fujioka himself had established. And that was the point. Now that the overall setting and tone of the game were established, throwing in a design like Kirin created a jarring and strong sense of contrast, which enhanced its role as a mysterious, otherworldly creature. Monster design was also one category of the production where the team's dedication to let every staff member contribute really shone. For example, lead programmer Norio Hirose produced 2 monster proposals in between his coding work. One proposal imagined a slimy, leech-like wyvern that ambushed players at riverbanks while they fished. This leech wyvern would then try to swallow players whole or cover them in its blood-sucking larvae. Over the course of multiple iterations, the leech wyvern was changed to live in caves rather than rivers, and instead of attacking players with its offspring, it was given the ability to paralyze them with electric shocks. And so, Hirose's first proposal turned into the monster known as Kezu. Bemused by the final design's distinctly phallic appearance, sound designer Kitamura named all of Kezu's sound effect files after various sexual innuendos and jokes. Hirose's second monster proposal was equally unique. He proposed the creation of a fish wyvern that would attack players both from the water and on land. His initial designs resembled a giant fish with human legs, and designer Nagayama would later say of it, "When I saw the fish wyvern proposal, I thought I was being pranked. Surely, I thought to myself, there is no way this would make it into the final game." The fish wyvern was eventually greenlit for the final game under the name Plesioth. Over the course of a few redesigns, Hirose's initial sketches were massaged into a believable wyvern design based on a coelacanth, and its fight centered around managing attacks from the water. Kojima insisted that the player should be able to force Plesioth out of the water with a fishing rod and special bait. Said special bait was chosen to be frogs, for no reason other than that Kojima was a big fan of frogs. As development continued, the team had to prepare for their next big public event, Tokyo Game Show in September 2003, where Monster Hunter would be playable for the public for the first time. A demo build of the game was ready ahead of time, but Fujioka was worried that players might not get the game in the short period of time they would have access to it. To avoid this, he suggested that the demo stand should include small, cartoony illustrations that depicted various gameplay actions as a sort of visual guide for players. Unfortunately, everyone on the team was too busy to follow up on this idea, and so Fujioka drew those instructive comics himself. Tokyo Game Show 2003 rolled around, and Monster Hunter presented itself with a small demo for attendees to play. The demo allowed players to explore the Forest and Hills map, where they could encounter Bullfango, Yankutku, and a Rathalos. While the E3 showcase had been a great success, the TGS event was a more mixed experience for the team. It became immediately apparent that the game's control scheme was nowhere near as intuitive as they had hoped. Nearly all players that tried the demo began mashing the face buttons of the controller, and the staff on site, which included Fujioka and Tsujimoto, had to sheepishly tell them that in this game, you fight using the analog stick. That being said, most players did seem to adjust to that fairly quickly once they got over their initial surprise, which the team took as a positive sign. But of all the attendees that visited the Monster Hunter TGS stand that day, one young man enjoyed it perhaps more than anyone else. This recent university graduate had been intrigued by Monster Hunter's E3 trailer and was eager to try it out. And he was immediately captivated. From the gameplay to the setting, it all fascinated this young man, who went on to play the demo in full 3 times, standing in line each time. The game was hard, and he struggled to grill any meat, let alone beat a Rathalos. But when the day ended, this young man walked away knowing that he had to play the full game once it was released. That young man's name was Yuya Tokuda. As Production Studio 1 determined that Monster Hunter would release in spring 2004, the development team worked hard to complete the game. One noteworthy incident occurred when Kento Kinoshita called in a meeting regarding the offline mode. Kinoshita had been making steady progress on the low-priority single-player mode, but increasingly objected to the idea that this mode should have no unique assets or features besides a different village. Kinoshita argued that if there was no special reward or aspect to the single-player experience, players would feel like they were cheated out of their time by playing a less complete version of the game they had paid for. Thus, he proposed the creation of a single-player exclusive monster that could serve as the ultimate end goal of the village mode. The team was initially apprehensive. At this point, the full number of large monsters in the game was shaping up to be around 15, and removing one of them from the core multiplayer experience in favor of the single-player mode did not sit well with many staff members. Kinoshita did eventually get his way, however, and was allowed to create one monster that would be exclusive to the village mode. To ensure a smooth and efficient design process, Kinoshita decided to make this monster a relative of an already finished design, similar to the relationship between Rathian and Rathalos. In this case, Kinoshita took Diablos as a base, a powerful desert wyvern with mighty horns that had been designed some time earlier. By tweaking the design and gameplay slightly, Kinoshita created a one-horned sibling of the Diablos, the Monoblos, which would serve as the exclusive single-player monster and the final boss of the village storyline. But no matter how smoothly other parts of production may have been going, there was one thing the team had been procrastinating on until the last minute, when it absolutely needed to be dealt with. Fujioka's second plot mandate, a secret final boss that would serve as the ultimate test for dedicated players. While the game was coming together and all other monsters had entered the final testing phases, this theoretical monster had not even been proposed or designed yet. One core problem was that while the team had discussed parts of this monster's design across the entire production cycle, including a handful of vague keywords, no one had actually compiled all of these discussions into one coherent document. The ideas for this final monster existed, but they were spread across scattered notes and desk folders, small bullet lists in the margins of other documents, and post-it notes. So to realize his vision, Fujioka would first have to hunt down these scraps of information to build a foundation on which this final monster could be based. But just like everyone else, Fujioka found himself with a mounting workload ahead of the imminent launch. Luckily, one of the higher-ups within Capcom that was particularly enthusiastic about the project offered to run around the office and collect the scattered design fragments from people's desks and notes, and compile a basic outline from that for Fujioka to use. In short order, said higher-up delivered exactly such an outline onto Fujioka's desk before having to rush off to his other duties again. But this was a good enough starting point, and Fujioka immediately went to work alongside any other designers that could spare the time. This final boss would have to be a real event, something that would stick with players for a long time, and that would serve as a suitable reward for truly mastering the game. Fujioka wanted to do something similar to what the team had achieved with Kirin, create something otherworldly that would intentionally clash with the rest of the world's design. There was, however, a more precise feeling he wished to capture, one based on an experience Fujioka had made in his earlier days at Capcom. At that time, a senior designer had talked to Fujioka about the Final Fight game series, and specifically the character Hagar. Being an enormous, muscular man, this character felt unique within the ordinary city environments of the game, despite being a very simple, almost bland design. The senior designer had mused that even basic designs can shine if put into a setting in which they stood out, and that sometimes that impact was enough to make a character or creature interesting. It was this lesson that Fujioka wished to utilize in the design of the final monster, and as he was perusing the outline document, a thought occurred. There was, in fact, an extremely simple design idea that he could use for this, one that he had told the team to move away from when he first became director. They had created a world of wyverns. So now, it was time to make a dragon. It was time to create Fatalis. In a way, this was the project coming full circle. At the beginning, the team had relied too heavily on traditional fantasy and had been held back by that tendency. The project had come together by rejecting the comfort zone of the genre and creating a bold new setting that focused on wyverns and their ecological niches, as well as the struggles of humans to coexist with them. And now, as this world was established, the final battle would be a return to those fantasy roots. Fujioka wanted the final monster to be a traditional fantasy dragon, He felt that this would not just create impact through contrast, but also stimulate the player's imagination. Just as players had begun to grasp the nature of this world, the game would show them something that defied understanding. Years later, he would explain his thought process thusly. My goal was to make the player understand that even such an out-of-place being could exist in this world. We also used flavor text in the game to hint at the legendary status of this entity. However, even if the goal was to create a simple dragon, Fujioka knew that they would still have to add that unique Monster Hunter quality to it. So he got together with the other designers and began brainstorming ways to add a degree of tangibility to this final dragon. One key aspect that could not be changed, however, was that the overall shape of Fatalis should be simple and iconic. Fujioka drew this principle from Buddhist iconography featuring Buddha and his neo-guardians. The latter displayed strength of a kind that humans understand, bulging muscles and a fierce expression. But to Fujioka, it was the Buddha that represented a greater, more overwhelming strength due to his simple disposition, an air of being so powerful that he didn't need to bother showing off. In Fujioka's own words, "The strength of a Neo is the kind you can understand, big muscles and physical power." The comparative serenity and calm of the great Buddha, however, seem like a veil, behind which lies strength of a kind entirely untouchable by mortals. Even the gentle smile can appear scary depending on how you look at it. In the same way, I wanted Fatalis to feel like a being that stands outside of our usual comprehension of power, where the only truth lies in our perspective on it. With this pillar in mind, the team worked to add flavor and texture to Fatalis without complicating the silhouette. While another designer worked on shaping the horns, Fujioka insisted on having a molten metal layer visible on the dragon's chest. This was inspired by the many stories of dragons sleeping on their treasure hoard, and Fujioka imagined Fatalis resting on the armors of fallen hunters, with the dragon's infernal body temperature passively melting them onto its chest. To highlight this and other physical features of the design, the team decided that fighting Fatalis would center around breaking various body parts, giving players the opportunity to observe its wounds and realize that even this inexplicable being bled and broke. Once these key elements were established, the rest of the design process for Fatalis went smoothly. Fujioka suggested that in order to increase the impact of the encounter, the battle should take place in a crumbling castle. He argued that the entire game took place in vast natural landscapes, so having the final fight occur in a man-made structure would again be a strong point of contrast. Thus, the team designed Castle Shrade, a battered castle featuring various armaments such as a Dragonator and a gate that could each be used to damage the dragon. The fight itself would also function differently than other hunts. Players would be able to pay different quest fees to unlock more features of Castle Shrade, with the most expensive quest variation giving the player the greatest advantage. Additionally, Fatalis would be fought across multiple quests, with each broken part signaling the player's advancement to the next stage. It was no mere battle. To fight Fatalis would be to wage war. Finally, the team had to decide on the unlock requirements for this fight. As Fujioka had envisioned it as a reward that only dedicated players could unlock, the team decided that to face Fatalis, a player would first have to defeat 100 monsters. 50 of these slain monsters would have to be Rathalos, as Fatalis was in many ways intended to be a dark counterpart to the game's flagship. In Fujioka's own words, "At the time, we considered Rathalos to be the ultimate challenge of the offline mode. When crafting the ultimate challenge of the online mode with Fatalis, we wanted it to feel connected to its offline equivalent, so we baked in related elements between the two monsters, such as Fatalis' theme just being the same as Rathalos but with chanting. The unlock requirement, including the slaying of many Rathalos, was also a part of this. Another way in which we highlighted the duality between the two monsters is that we based Fatalis' armor design off of Rathalos' armor. As you can see, Rathalos and Fatalis were always inherently connected." Fujioka would however also request that only players that had beaten Lao Shan Lung should be able to unlock Fatalis, as those two monsters were also connected. They were the two narrative pillars of the game, and Fujioka mused that Lao would only be moving as a way to escape from Fatalis, and that this would be a horrible omen. After all, when mountains begin to walk, doom is sure to approach. With the monster roster complete, the team shifted into the final phase of development. This period was rather hectic, as many different features had to be rapidly bug tested and fixed before release. There were also times when an error would lead to new design decisions. In one case, a mistake occurred that switched around the armor designs for Plesioth and Cephalos. Instead of fixing this, the team decided that it would actually be pretty interesting if the armors were swapped, as that would be sure to surprise players. And so, they left it as is, with Plesioth armor becoming Cephalos armor, and vice versa. One final element that would be altered right before release were the player animations. During the development, the team had relied on the chat function and a keyboard to send messages and text communications. But without a connected keyboard, Monster Hunter's chat was slow and fairly cumbersome to use. Thus, the team decided at the very last minute to add in gestures that players could perform in order to communicate simple things to each other, such as approval or a call for attention. This addition was so last minute, in fact, that the Monster Hunter team could not book any motion capture actors in time, leading to the various staff members recording the motion capture data using their own bodies. Monster Hunter was finally released on March 11th, 2004, exclusively for the Sony PlayStation 2. What had started as an ambitious project with a tiny team had now finally become a fully fledged game, featuring an entirely original fantasy setting, 6 unique weapon classes, and a roster of diverse and powerful monsters. The game was divided into an offline and online mode, and featured 2 difficulty levels called Low Rank and High Rank. In the end, the credits of Monster Hunter would list over 220 names. Launch day was immediately marred by the game's main server crashing due to high player counts, forcing Tsujimoto to fix it up in a hurry. While this was naturally rather stressful, it boded well for how many people were interested in the game. In the first days following launch, various staff members would log onto the game's online mode and try to help players that seemed stuck, pretending to just be regular hunters sharing important knowledge on where to gather, what to craft, etc. Players, in turn, seemed to be gelling well with the game. But the team could not relax yet. Not only did they have to make sure the servers ran well and maintain the game's post-launch marketing, it would also be some time before sales data and critical reviews would be released. So for a while, they played their own game, nervously wondering if they had succeeded. Their first taste of the game's reception would come on March 19th, 1 week after the game's release, with the publication of Weekly Famitsu magazine, volume 796. As the longest-running video game publication in the country, Famitsu was, and still is today, considered one of the most important outlets for video game writing and reviews in all of Japan. The magazine uses a scoring system where each game is reviewed by 4 critics, each of which then writes a short review and gives the game a score between 1 and 10, with 10 being the highest. These 4 scores are then added together to create the official Famitsu score, with the highest possible rating being 40 out of 40. And so, on March 19th, 2004, Monster Hunter's official Famitsu score read 32, with each of the 4 individual reviewers giving the game an 8 out of 10. The 4 critics praised the game's beautiful world and graphics, its more casual elements like fishing and grilling, and its satisfying progression systems. While one reviewer noted that their online play was unstable, and another called out the controls for taking some time to get used to, the conclusion of Famitsu was that Monster Hunter was a well-crafted and engaging game that was well worth a try. A resounding endorsement from the country's chief authority on video game reviews. Other reviews would generally follow this tone. The game was beautiful, satisfying to play, and engaged players at all skill levels, with the controls and occasional online instability remaining the dominant negative points. But overall, Monster Hunter received favorable reviews upon initial release within its home country. They had made it. With this first frightening hurdle overcome, the Monster Hunter team allowed itself some celebrations. The entire staff team even held an in-office speedrunning tournament to see who could clear the 1-star village quests the fastest. In the following days, many of the developers would be able to finally play the final build of the game for the first time themselves, as most of them had only ever participated in limited testing of specific sections. This led to some surprises. For example, the various maps of the game were intended to have no background music at all, to heighten the sense of immersion. But the team was surprised to find that Area 7 of the Forest and Hills map was underscored with a unique piece of music. Sound director Kitamura had composed this haunting piece and added it into the game without telling anyone. Kitamura himself had quite an extreme post-launch experience. After looking forward to playing the full game himself, he found that he was so racked with anxiety over how the game would perform and how it could have been better that he struggled enjoying his time with it. Kitamura would eventually solve this issue by gaming with a notepad on his side, writing down any ideas for improvements or changes to a possible sequel to calm himself down. Norio Hirose, meanwhile, would finally get to hunt Kezu and Plesioth, the 2 monsters he had essentially created. Unfortunately, he found that he disliked fighting them. But even among the development team, few people were as deeply affected by Monster Hunter as Yuya Tokuda, who of course bought the game on release day. After his initial positive impression of the game at Tokyo Game Show, he was blown away by the full game, being especially impressed by the ways in which Monster Hunter built its world and setting through the use of its environment and monster designs. Playing the game awakened in him a strong desire to participate in this world's creation and design. And so, he did just that. In April of 2004, just over a month after the game's release, Yuya Tokuda applied for a job as game designer at Capcom, with the specific request to work with the people that had made Monster Hunter. He was promptly hired and joined Fujioka and Tanaka's team. Tokuda's first day at work included an introduction to the various documentations regarding the development of Monster Hunter, during which he ended up spoiling himself on the existence of Fatalis, a monster he himself had not unlocked yet in his playthrough. As the game continued to receive positive reviews and sales data began to trickle in, the team made an interesting discovery. Monster Hunter was popular among boys and girls alike. Fujioka and his team had just assumed that a world of giant swords and bleeding wyverns would appeal most strongly to male demographics, and were thus surprised to see that they had also won over many female players. Monster Hunter was a game for everyone in the truest sense, and so the team decided to develop potential future games with a more mixed demographic in mind. Production Studio One hiring more women in general at the time also led to the first few female staff members within the Monster Hunter team. According to sound designer Kitamura, he himself took this time as an opportunity to reconsider his attitudes. As the office gained more female employees, he went back and changed the file names for the Kezu sound effects, removing their previously sexual titles out of respect for his new co-workers. But one question ultimately remained. How well did Monster Hunter fulfill the expectations set out by the Studio One initiative? Did it sell 1 million copies by itself? In short, no. After the initial Japanese release, Monster Hunter also received an international version that included new features, such as the new dual blades weapon type and quality of life improvements such as a larger item box. But even with this additional release, by the end of 2004, Monster Hunter had sold a respectable 288,000 copies. Not a failure by any means, but a far cry from 1 million. In the eyes of Capcom, that was however not a problem. The team had proven that their concept of a casual online action game had an audience, and their immense passion for building this world had resulted in a mountain of unfinished and discarded ideas that could be used in future projects. Monster Hunter had proven that it was worth investing in, and that it should become a series of games rather than remaining a one-off. After all, if the resulting franchise could cumulatively crack the 1 million unit barrier, then the initiative would still be a success. And so, the team looked towards the future. Where else could they take Monster Hunter? Fujioka made an odd suggestion. Instead of immediately creating a full sequel, he felt that the team should re-release the game with one more level added onto it. The intention was that this new release would be a way to thank players that had supported the original game, and to give them one final challenge to truly push themselves beyond the limits of the first game. In this new Gratitude release, monsters were to receive alternative versions, and while it would include the full original game, players that had already beaten Monster Hunter could transfer their save files to this new game to just continue playing. After some discussions, the team agreed that this was the right way forward, and the fact that it would be fairly quick and cheap to make was just a bonus. The team also quickly landed on a name for this new version, Monster Hunter G, with the new difficulty being called G rank. Producer Tanaka would later explain the reasoning for this name. The G stands for great, or guts. It's an expression of gratitude to everyone who supported the original game. You all did great. But it is also a challenge to them. Do you have the guts to face what comes next? And that is how Monster Hunter G was born. The Monster Hunter team thus quickly began development on this upgraded version, and the production proved to be the first project for many new recruits, such as Yuya Tokuda. But one man was once again looking even further. Kaname Fujioka was ultimately very happy with how Monster Hunter had turned out, but there was one thing he could not help but feel disappointed by: the tedium of setting up online play. The town of Minegard which served as the online hub for players to meet and team up in, was a tremendous achievement to him. But Fujioka felt that actually connecting with other players was slow, unstable, and often cumbersome. He was particularly struck by one incident in which an in-office play session was delayed because Sugimoto had to run around town to find a 10-meter LAN cable to be able to participate. Fujioka's vision of online multiplayer had to be more seamless than that. And to his great intrigue, hardware capable of delivering just that was about to hit the market. The PlayStation Portable, which was going to release at the end of 2004, promised local online multiplayer capabilities, with a focus on quick and easy ad hoc connectivity. Sensing that this was a great opportunity, Fujioka made a request to Capcom to allow some members of their team to experiment towards porting Monster Hunter to the PSP. He even named a potential director for the sub-team, Yasunori Ichinose, a senior designer who had served as scenario director for Resident Evil Outbreak. Fujioka had spoken to Ichinose in the months following Monster Hunter's release, and felt that this man understood the series perfectly. Ichinose himself described his playstyle like this: "On weekdays, I'd collect things like honey and prepare consumable items, while on weekends I would actually try hunting large monsters. It was a slow but satisfying weekly cycle. I really felt like a monster hunter." And so, while the main Monster Hunter team worked on Monster Hunter G, Ichinose and a small group of developers began tinkering on how to bring the series to a handheld system. From this moment on, the Monster Hunter series would see many new developments and successes. Through the release of Monster Hunter G and the sequel, Monster Hunter DOS, the series would finally push past the 1 million barrier and fulfill the initiative's goals. Yasunori Ichinose would successfully bring the series to the PlayStation Portable, where it would sell exceptionally well and establish itself as a mainstay within Japanese gaming culture. Kaname Fujioka would continue to direct all of the console games the series released for the next decade, refining his vision of this fantasy world with each release. Ryozo Tsujimoto would rise to become the series producer and be involved with all aspects of the game. And Yuya Tokuda would continue working on every Monster Hunter game, taking notes and meticulously cataloging his thoughts and feelings on what Monster Hunter should be, with it, of course, culminating in him directing the two best-selling games in the series and transforming Monster Hunter into the premier franchise within Capcom's catalog. But these and many other stories will have to wait for another day. What matters for now is that all of it started right here, with a game about giant swords and even bigger monsters. Special thanks to A. Jackson, Admiral Frost, Alistair in Wonderland, August, Austin, Autumns, Black Ace 202, B, Bruggy, Chocolate Coat, Claire Miboon, Darkest, Destro, Dragonlord, Dissy, Echo but Evil, Ethan Toombs, Theopuz, Faye/Sleepy Tiki, Fieden, Glitch NPC, Good Hunter, Harpier, Hellbug Hunter, Hutsan, I'm Just Happy to Be Here, Inepts, Iron Camel, It's Robin Now, Jacob Coleman, Joey Tribby 58, Jonathan Ginsberg, Magenta, Carl the Crab, Kelly Barnett, Kogath, Lieferdienst, Logan Bilodeau, Lone Strider, Lufish, M1Have12, Macaroni Leviathan, Makamawi, Makot02, MattHat124, Meta Defiance, Mr. Pyramid, Molly Mockery, My Name Gone, Nico Soleil, Nils Schlatter, Noah Schantz, Oakwood Tree, Paige Gandalf Soda, Person 212, Precum King, Punonym, Quali, Rambling Robin, Raspberry, Regal Eagle, Resident Neko Arc, Wronger 97, Rose, Ryan Hook, Skiba, Shebo, Silly Wizard 97, Siragon, Sir Newt, Soruka, Tacti Wolf, The Iciest Man Alive, The Dollarfish, Tsuki Midnight Boshi, Unk with Good Puss, Uthduna is an Octopus, Varaxus, Vulgar Beast, Wandering Soul, Wolf of Time, Zaffi, Zino Garcia, Zai Bandit, Zion H. Jorgensen, Kuroneko.